All right, now we're going to be pulling clutch cover off, speedo gear, gear shift mechanism, starter, and then we'll go ahead and split that case. So first thing we're going to do is pull the 8 millimeters all the way around. We've got an oil line running through here with a banjo bolt. That's a 12 millimeter bolt. So we'll go ahead and pull the oil line bolt here. It's got crush washers on either side of it. You make sure to replace those if you are replacing. If you're pulling that apart and go back together. You've got your speedo gear here, and that speedo gear, the cable is held in by a Phillips that runs right down inside here. So to pull that cable out of there, you got to remove this Phillips screw going right here, and then just kind of walk it out of there. Now to pull this, you've got a screw coming in from the top going down here. We've already started because sometimes these are a little bit of a challenge. And it's all aluminum, so you want to be careful pulling that. But you can kind of just walk that out. That's what it looks like when you pull it out. That's the speedo gear there. It turns inside there. When we pull this cover, you'll see the gear that it turns on. But there's where your cable rides right in there. So we'll go ahead, 8 millimeter, pull all these bolts around the side of this clutch cover. We'll start with the dipstick. All right, and I've got 15 of them all the way around there. So if I were to put this back together, I'd know I was starting at the dipstick and go clockwise, and I would just line them up like so. That way I know which order they go in and come going back together. So I won't have to worry about that. We'll go ahead and pull these and pull this clutch cover. Now, what I generally do is grab a small hammer about this size, and what you can do is put a little pressure going up on the case. Now a lot of times we'll just pump right off of there and just lift it right off of there. Now this dipstick will sometimes hold you up, so I like to remove that, but then there's also a gasket in there that'll sometimes hold you up. You want to be careful that you try to keep all that together so that you know going back together what goes where. So there's your gasket there. Again, obviously replace that. We've got your arm here for your shift mechanism. We've just got a little oil sitting inside there, so we're going to stick that face down on there. We'll pull these clutches now, and we've got a gear here that you can see is loose. Now going back together, you don't want them loose, but you don't need to have them really tight because of this keeper here. So go ahead, move that keeper down. We'll find the right socket here. I guess we don't even need to, but 1 1/8 is what that takes to come off of there. Normal threads, so we've got counterclockwise coming off of there. And we'll go ahead and pull this inner clutch pack here, and that's what the inner clutch pack looks like. Now measurement, you measure the shoes, you get them, you want to make sure that they're within the specs, going back together, and then we've got your clutch outer gear housing here. Now this clutch outer gear can become grooved, and you don't want that. This is a one-way gear. That bearing can go out. Now pulling this clutch, this centrifugal clutch apart, you see there's grooves in this clutch pack that's dipped in. If all you're doing is replacing the centrifugal clutch, you line this gear up with those grooves, and we've got one on the other side of the clutch, and we'll just be able to pull that right out of there. Now if this clutch was turned a little bit and wasn't in where the groove was, it would not allow this gear to pull up like that. So, and you can see going back together, it would hit that clutch basket. So if line that clutch up, you're able just to pull that, slide that centrifugal clutch outer gear off very easily. Here we got your shift mechanism here, and we've got a washer, and then and pull this shift assembly out. Now this is spring loaded, so you kind of want to be careful. And it's going all the way through. You know what, I think there's a keeper or a circlip holding that other side in, so we'll wait on that. But right now we'll pull this clutch pack and the 10 millimeter bolts around the outside. And we've got 5 of those 10mm bolts. And I just do it a little bit at a time because they are spring loaded. You don't want all the pressure on one screw just because it is an aluminum basket. Too much pressure on one screw could break the post off of that clutch basket. So once you get them all out there, then I just take pull it like that. Now same thing, flatten these. The keeper here, and you can see that clutch spins freely. You don't want to replace that keeper with a new one because you can tell when you bend it over like that it's going to break. Just be like bending a wire too many times. So hold your clutch pack, kind of hang on to it like that. Now when you get this off, what I do is put this back on there, and I'll show you why. Go ahead and snug these up. You don't have to tighten them because you'll have to remove it again, putting that clutch back together. But you want enough pressure on there to where those plates don't turn. And again, you kind of go in a crisscross pattern. I like to tighten them all down to the same amount so we're not putting any more pressure on either one of them. Now what you're able to do, just slide that clutch pack out like that. You've got your whole clutch pack. If all you're doing is replacing the basket, which you can do, I wouldn't suggest it. I'd replace the friction disc at the same time, but you can pull the basket out that way. You've got a washer in here that is grooved that turns in there. So the likelihood of that being in the right spot to pull it up is very unlikely. So you've got to kind of turn it to get to the spot where it needs to go. And then you're able just to lift that basket out. There's a spacer in behind there. So now you can take and set this clutch pack inside that clutch basket. Keep that all together, keeps everything lined up. And then we've got your old push rod here and then your bearing. So now we'll pull your this is your crank balancer here, your gear. We'll go ahead and bend that tab. Again, that one broke, so that one will need replaced. And pull that there. Now this is just going to pull off there, and that's as far as that one will go, but that's for your balancer gear there. Got your crankshaft here, circlip holding this gear in, but also it's spring loaded in behind there. Not when you pull that circlip off, it's not going to fly up. It's just a spring-loaded gear. It's kind of got some tension on it. So we'll go ahead and turn that. If you turn and it hits, that's the crank hitting the balancer gear. Those have to be lined up, and we've got a dot on your crank balancer gear and your dot on your crank. Those have to be lined up going back together, or you're going to have this noise for a short amount of time before your engine locks up. Now we can go ahead and pull this gear, but what happens is, I'll pull this spacer off so you can see. Pull this gear, but these springs will stay, some will stay and some will come with this gear. So you just want to be careful. Now every other one, because there's a pin that goes through every other spring. So be careful pulling these springs that you got the pin with it. It's a small pin, that size there. But you can see why those pins are there. It kind of keeps a firmer tension on that. Now we'll go ahead and pull oil pump. And what I do to know which bolts to take out, line this gear up with all 3 Phillips. If you've got 1.5 Phillips that you can see, then that's not where you need to be. You need to line all 3 holes up with all 3 Phillips. Then what I do, and I suggest doing, is get an impact driver like this with a Phillips head on there and take it out that way. You can do it without an impact driver, but you do not want to round these off because you've got no way of getting a vice grip on there to pull them out if you need to do it that way. What you have to do is drill them out. And when you're dealing with a crankcase, You don't want to be drilling a bolt out if you don't have to. So spend the money and buy one of those tools. Now get in behind there with something. And that's held together. There's a gasket, so there is some tension on there. So once that gasket's broke free, all the way around, it's a whole lot easier, but this one's being a little bit of a challenge. You don't want to score anything up with a screwdriver, so find a spot that's not a gasket surface if you're going to put a screwdriver in behind there and put some pressure on it. And you don't want to turn the screwdriver on a gasket surface either. There we go, able to pull that up. You can see the gasket was sticking there. And you can turn that a half turn and be able to flip that upside down. Those bolts won't fall out. So there's your oil pump there. We've got an oil line here. And we'll pull the starter here, 8mm bolts holding that starter in, just 2 of those. And that's sealed up by an O-ring, so just keep that in mind when you're pulling the starter, that O-ring is probably what's holding you up. Alright, and that starter's off there. Spin it, hook it up to power, make sure there's no noises. Make sure it's not stuck. Next we'll grab a 12mm, pull the oil line off. These are special bolts, so don't just put any bolts in there. They're banjo bolts, meaning they have a hole going through them to let the oil through into that oil line. This I guess this doesn't have a clip, it's just got a good amount of pressure. Could mean it's bent. We'll check and see, but a lot of times it will just slide right out. And that's not the case for this one. Could be banged up on the other side, could have slight bend to it. Extremely difficult coming out of here. Could just be buildup. Alright, there's your shift shaft there. We'll have to inspect that to see why that was so difficult to come apart. So next we'll pull some bolts around the outside that is keeping the motor together, or the crankcase together. We've got a 10mm down here for your shift arm. And that's pulled. We've got a Torx down there. And I don't like to turn those with an impact. So I use a ratchet for that. And a lot of times they don't turn hard, but once you get them loosened up, then you can use an impact. But I don't like to use an impact just because that a lot of times will slam that into place and that'll break it. That's a common problem for these, is to break. So this one's in good condition. You can see right there generally where this keeper is. The keeper is too small for what this does. A lot of times that'll break that gear right there, or that drum right there. So just be careful going back together that you don't put a lot of pressure on that. We've got a shift linkage over here with the 10 millimeter. And that just kind of pops off of there. We've got a 12 millimeter. Excuse me, a 14. And this is just a bolt with a spring and a ball in it. So there's a spring and the balls stay down in there, but that'll come out when we're pulling the motor apart. So at this point now we will flip this over. Just checking to see if there's any more bolts that we need to pull. We could pull these two, not necessary, but just to clean this motor up. 2 8 millimeters. This is for the shift cable. Spin that motor. We've got your bevel gear over here that we'll finish pulling. Just slide that right off. Again, that goes with that bevel gear, that output shaft. And then we have 14 8 millimeter bolts around the outside of this, 2 in the inside of this crankcase behind where that flywheel was. Then we've got 2 Allens, one here, one here. So if this has got a lot of debris on it, you won't be able to see that, but it's an Allen that's kind of sunk down into that crankcase. Now we are ready to split that motor. And just tap on it here to kind of break that seal. Sometimes you can kind of hear once it's broke. Here when it breaks free. And we'll get it in there. Now when I'm using a screwdriver, I like to use a big one if I have to and go where a motor mount goes, because that is not a gasket sealed surface. If you don't even have to use one at all, that's better. The bigger you use, the better. And you don't want to take a hammer and use it as a punch to slide in between there, because that'll damage surfaces. So there's a handful of places on this motor that a bolt goes through, and those make a nice spot to kind of use your screwdriver or a crowbar to kind of open it up. Again, if you don't have to, it's not the greatest idea just because you don't want to take that risk of damaging a gasket surface, but those are not a gasket surface. So you kind of walk it out then. And I like to find a spot where all the gears, either side, but where the gears are staying all to one side. You're going to make sure you find that spot and set it on that side, because when you pull that case, you want as many of those gears to stay in one spot as you can. So if you find that all the gears are kind of staying with the crank on the left hand side, then set that left hand side down and lift up on the other side. So we're getting close here. It just takes a little bit of time, but we are coming apart here. It looks like we're hooked on something. And that is the crankcase split. And that's one side of your crankcase. and then here's where all the gears are. All the gears seem to have stayed in there. You want to inspect this side, make sure there's no washers sitting there loose. That's going to drop somewhere where you can't find them. Looks like everything stayed in this side. So we've got your balancer here, and that will just slide out. That was this gear that we looked at. And I'll just kind of walk out. We'll put those together. We've got your crankshaft here, obviously. We've got your shift drum here and here. So this is where that bolt went down into, that's spring loaded and had that ball on the other side. And those, so we'll just got to remember to grab that ball. Getting the, I don't know if you can see here, but getting the shift shafts out are important to do first. That kind of frees up a lot of gears, but pull those out slightly from the case, and then you're able just to walk those gears out. And we'll do some cleaning up on the bench here so we can get this transmission apart. And then we've got another shift drum here. And this is the one where I said be very careful going back together, because there's a small keeper that has a tendency to break. So you want to make sure that keeper's lined up, going back together. And then that's that little Torx screw there for that one. So kind of same thing, this has got a cap and a spring on it. And then pulling that transmission, I try to find gears that are going to come out together. So if I can kind of grab a handful of one shaft or two shafts at one time and kind of walk them out together, that's a lot of times the best way of doing it. That way it kind of keeps everything together. And then again, keep an eye out for loose gears. Make sure you remember how those come apart. And like you can see here, I've got a washer that stayed there. So you want to make sure we slip that back onto the transmission, that gear set, and then walk this set out. That's your main assembly. There's where your there's where your clutch basket sits on there. Another gear set here. A lot of these just kind of got to wiggle them out of there. But they kind of all work hand in hand, so sometimes you can't get one out without taking the other out. There's this mechanism. Again, washer fell down there. And then pull the shift drum. And that ball may be holding this. It's not. That ball fell down in there, but or it fell out there when we took that case up. And then just kind of walk these out as well. So there is some of the reverse shift linkage parts there. And then we've got your crank in there. Now this crank, you can tap it out that way. Again, you don't want to damage this area here, so don't just bang on that. A lot of times what I do is replace that bearing as well. So I'll take some tool, chisel or a large punch, pound on that bearing there from all three of those sides that you can see. A lot of times that bearing and everything will come out. I always replace the bearings going back together just because we're there and it's an easy thing to do. They're not that expensive when you're talking splitting a case again. So that is a crankcase split on an '89 Yamaha Big Bear 350.